All right, good evening, everyone. On behalf of Metro, I would like to welcome you, whether you are joining in person, by phone, or virtually, to today's public engagement session for the Blue Orange Silver Capacity and Reliability Study, also known as the BOS Study. My name is Latoya Thomas, and I will be your moderator this evening. For background, Metro is conducting this study to address identified long-standing issues and opportunities on the blue, orange, and silver lines, including capacity, reliability, equity, and long-term sustainability. After over 2 years of study, the BOS Study team has identified 6 alternatives for improving the blue, orange, and silver lines. Metro now needs your help in selecting the best options for the region. Today's session is one of 3 public engagement events that has been hosted throughout DC, Maryland, and Virginia over the past few weeks. And it is focused on understanding the 6 alternative scenarios analyzed by WMATA and its consultant partners at RHI. The goals of today's session are to share these alternatives and hear your input, both positive and negative, on the proposed scenarios. All of the feedback will be compiled after each session and reviewed in depth by the study team in order to recommend a locally preferred alternative, or LPA, to Metro's Board of Directors. Before I turn the meeting over to our presenters, I want to take a moment to walk you through the logistics for today's meeting and our ground rules. We will have a 30-minute series of presentations from representatives of Metro and the lead consultant, HNTB, on the alternative scenarios before opening up for a 45-minute Q&A session at approximately 7 o'clock. I will give additional instructions before we begin Q&A so everyone knows how best to participate. For our ground rules, we want to foster a space where anyone who has a comment or a question can offer that feedback freely. So to that end, let's remember the following. Please participate openly and respectfully and allow others to do so as well. Please save your questions for the Q&A period. We will provide detailed instructions for how to submit questions at that time. For in-person and phone participants, as we are managing several methods of receiving questions and comments simultaneously, please wait until you are called on before providing your questions or feedback. For webinar participants, the chat box has been disabled, but you will use the Q&A box to provide questions and comments. And again, we'll review all of this prior to starting Q&A. And last but not least, for phone participants, you will receive specific instructions prior to the start of Q&A on how to provide verbal comments, should you wish to come off mute. So with that, I will now turn the mic over to Mark Phillips, Director of Regional Mobility Planning at Metro.
It's a mistake. Thank you, Latoya, and thank you, everybody in the room and online, for joining us tonight to be willing to spend your evening to talk about our blue, orange, and silver corridor capacity and reliability study. My name is Mark Phillips, Metro's Director of Regional Mobility Planning, and tonight, me and Mark Niles from HNTB on the consultant side are going to talk about why we're doing this study and what we've been doing, how we identified and developed a range of alternatives to address some of the needs and opportunities on the blue, orange, and silver lines. We're going to talk about what the 6 current alternatives are, and next steps, where we go from here. At a high level, we started this study back in 2019 to address a range of needs and opportunities facing Metro operations and our customers and some regional opportunities. We translated those needs and opportunities after identifying them into a series of 4 goal statements, which are aligned with our new strategic transformation plan, the Your Metro plan, which some of you may have worked on. At the end, the study will conclude with our board of directors choosing a preferred alternative, or something that's known as a locally preferred alternative, and we'll move that LPA into next steps, which I'll talk about a little later in the presentation. I just want to take a moment to talk about the Your Metro plan, that strategic transformation plan that was approved by our board earlier this year. Apparently one of the monitors doesn't want to, okay, there we go. The Your Metro plan, which, again, there was some public engagement. I feel like a lot of you may have been involved in that. The effort is to make sure that Metro is the region's trusted way to move people safely and sustainably across the region. And to attain that vision, it sets up 4 goals. And completing this study, completing the Blue, Orange, and Silver study, as well as some of the ideas and projects that might come out of it, is instrumental to advancing 3 of those 4 goals and is actually identified in the plan as a priority initiative. So to get back to the study itself, this slide actually gives you a timeline of what we've done since the study inception and kind of shows you where we're going next. Again, we started in 2019, going out to the public and some of our stakeholder committees to talk about the study, talk about those needs and opportunities. We have had 2 rounds of public engagement so far. This is our 3rd. We also have 6 different stakeholder committees, and we talked to elected officials and got a lot of feedback from all those different people. To date, we've identified 6 alternatives, and we've completed a robust, rigorous analysis of the costs and benefits comparing those 6 alternatives. So that's all the work we've completed to date. Now we're ready and we're engaged in this 3rd round of public engagement, coming back out with those 6 alternatives, talking to all of you, showing the results of that cost-benefit analysis. When we're complete with this 3rd round of public engagement, which goes until the end of September, we're going to go back to elected officials and our stakeholder committees, get additional feedback, and then take all that information to our board of directors and support them in choosing that preferred alternative. Quick word on what that really means. I just want people to understand that even though we're showing 6 alternatives today, the study doesn't result in a construction plan, a project that we're going to start working on and building, next year, in the next 5 years. The locally preferred alternative is simply the one of those 6 alternatives, or a combination of different parts of those alternatives, that will advance into additional design, planning, development work, and environmental review. One word before I get to some of the more interesting topics for today about what this meeting is about, what the purpose of coming out tonight is. So I mentioned, again, we have those 6 alternatives. We have that cost-benefit analysis, and we're going to describe that. We're going to show you the results. And we're asking you to give us feedback on which of those 6 you prefer, and maybe some ideas for potential names or we have a Q&A session at the end. You can share any idea you want. But I need to underline that because we've been working since 2019 and we're near the end of the study, we're not revisiting the goals, the alternatives themselves, or any of the cost-benefit analysis that went into it. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the factors that help shape those 6 alternatives, how we identified and developed these ideas for your consideration. One of them was that range of needs and opportunities I talked about, and which I'll provide a little bit more detail on in a second. But those are operational needs and capacity needs of Metro, like our crowding issues, how many trains we can operate, the reliability, how often it's on-time performance, but also some broader, higher-level regional goals, like supporting development, equity, sustainability. We took all those needs and ideas, needs and opportunities, and crafted goal statements, and then did a lot of data analysis. So that's the second group of factors, the second type of factors that went into the alternatives. And we went out to the public, we went out to the stakeholders, as I mentioned, for over a year and a half, and talked about all that analysis and all those needs and opportunities and got their feedback. So all 3 of those things together produced the 6 alternatives that we're going to talk about. But first, I want to walk through a little bit more detail on those needs and opportunities so you can understand what these 6 alternatives are trying to do. The first is talking about our capacity constraints in the corridor. Most of you know that the Blue, Orange, and Silver lines share one tunnel and set of tracks between Roslyn and Virginia and basically the Anacostia River, so in all of downtown DC. With that arrangement, with that configuration, and with our existing system and technology, we can operate 26 trains per hour per direction in that shared corridor. That means that if we're operating like 8 to 7 minute headways, we can split that up equally between the 3 lines. We can operate 7 to 8 trains per hour on all 3. But if we try to go to 26 trains per hour like we were doing in 2016, 6-minute peak headways, we actually had to reduce service on one of those lines in order to provide 6-minute headways on the other 2. So that graphic you can see on the right hand of the slide shows what that service plan looked like. We ran 10 to 11 trains per hour on the Orange and the Silver, but we had to reduce the Blue line to 5 trains an hour every 12 minutes. That capacity is working fine now, but our regional partners, the cities and counties that we serve, are estimating, this is not Metro, but this is our partners, estimating that the areas within about a mile of these 3 lines will grow significantly by 2045. That's 37% more people and 30% more jobs. That will increase our ridership. And we're estimating that by 2040, we'll have the same crowding issues that we had before the pandemic, that we've had for almost 20 years. So we need to have a solution for that. Similarly, because we operate those 3 lines through one set of tracks, if there's a service issue, a disruption, or a work zone on one line, it's going to impact the other 2. We had one this evening. And actually, because the blue line also runs on the same set of tracks as the yellow line in Virginia, if the disruption is severe enough, it can actually impact green and yellow line service. But we also, we have a really well-developed and large capital program, which is like really fixing a lot of maintaining our state of good repair. But that means a lot of work zones. That means a lot of construction activity in the foreseeable future. So we want to explore options, both to better manage service disruptions when they happen, but also to get around our work zones more easily and reduce the negative impacts on those work zones. In a similar vein, we think we can build resilience into the metro system and increase connectivity by giving our customers more travel options, more path choices for the trips they make most commonly. So right now, they all have to take the blue, orange, and silver line. Maybe there's another one that they can take. Maybe there's bus rapid transit lines they can take. In terms of connectivity, there's also an opportunity. When you're looking at projects of this scale, needs and opportunities at this scale, we have an opportunity to address some of the historic system constraints. For example, having 2 different Farragut stations, right? Like the red line serves Farragut North, the blue, orange, and silver lines have Farragut West. If you want to transfer between them, you have to exit the station, walk to the other one. Maybe there's an opportunity to combine those into one big, like Farragut Superstation. In a similar vein, with the Union Station, it's a huge, incredibly important regional transportation hub. We have VRE, MARC, Amtrak, the Red Line, tons of buses. Maybe there's an opportunity, considering that the region is redeveloping that, the DC is redeveloping it, and Amtrak is trying to provide more service, and MARC wants to do run-through service, that we can really leverage that kind of investment with another metro rail line or better enhanced metro transit connections. So those are the needs and opportunities in terms of metro operations, metro capacities, and the things that are customer facing that we think we need to address. We also have an opportunity to help the region advance some of its goals and meet some of its ends. So one of them is development. The region, as we mentioned, I mentioned how our jurisdictional partners think this corridor is going to grow a lot by 2045, but there's a lot of other places that they're also targeting for development. And we all know that this region works best when intensive development is matched with good transit, high capacity transit, a lot of transit options. So this means strengthening the transit that already exists and trying to catalyze development around the stations we already have. But it might also mean looking at some of these areas that our jurisdictional partners have targeted for intensive growth and matching that, providing better service, providing better transit to those places. We also want to be able to help the region advance its equity goals, its equity aims, and our own. It's a driving part of our mission. Equity is central to everything that Metro does, to every service we put on the ground. We have an opportunity here to expand transit operations and high-frequency transit to high-need areas that don't have it today, and try to start to address some of the east-west divide you've probably heard about. You can see on the map, the places in orange are the ones that our regional partners have identified as equity emphasis areas, or places where there's a higher than average concentration of people of color, of low-income people, people without cars. Really the areas that you might want to, at least at first, focus on for big transit investments. And finally, hopefully a lot of people in the room know this, the region actually has really ambitious goals for fighting climate change and for giving us all a more sustainable future. For example, the region's leaders through the Council of Governments have actually committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. We cannot do that. This region cannot do that unless transit is a core strategy. And that means more of it, that it runs more often and more reliably. So all of that at a high level and, fairly quickly in a few slides, that's all of the needs and opportunities that we identified that we're trying to at least address and hopefully fix or advance through the 6 alternatives I mentioned. When we got to those alternatives, again, with a lot of public and stakeholder input, we have 6 committees of our jurisdictional partners, community-based organizations. We've talked to elected officials. We've also had 2 rounds of public engagement, and again, doing this one now. So back in the summer of 2019, we came out, we told people about the study, we talked about these needs and opportunities, and we let them know what was going to be happening over the next 2 years. And then in the winter of 2019, we held really focused workshops where we came with a bunch of data sets, we came with some initial ideas or project concepts about different types of transit projects that might meet these needs and opportunities. And we worked with you, we let you draw. We had maps, we said, show us what you think we should do. And we ended up getting something like 275 ideas from that engagement. We did a lot more rigorous analysis after that. We tried to look at our 4 goals, these needs and opportunities, match up all those 275 ideas with how well they would advance those needs. And we wound up with the 6 alternatives that we have today. So that's, again, the focus of this round of public engagement, showing you those 6 alternatives, discussing their costs, their benefits, their relative impacts, and trying to get your input so we can inform our leadership, our board of directors, and the regional leaders of what you prefer. All of that input, and this is where I'm going to wrap up and hand it to my colleague from HNTV, all of that input gave us 4 goal statements. This is important for a study like this. So at a high level, out of these 6 alternatives, that locally preferred alternative, the option that our board selects, should achieve 4 things for the metro system and the region. Providing enough capacity to meet our projected ridership demand in 2040, improving our on-time reliability, our on-time performance and reliability, increasing our operational flexibility and helping us kind of be more cost efficient. And finally, supporting the sustainability goals, development goals, and equity goals by supporting sustainable development and increasing access to opportunity, specifically and especially from equity-focused communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Mark Niles, who's going to walk you through the actual alternatives.
Thanks. So, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes and give you a little overview of the alternatives. As shown here on the slide, you can see our alternatives kind of fit into 3 basic categories or types of alternatives, right? A no-build alternative, which generally looks at whether the needs in the future can be met with the projects that the region has already committed to build in the next 20 years, and they're already committed to fund. We looked at an option that is called the rail optimization and bus service option. So these are kind of lower cost things that we could do to meet needs in the corridor, lower costs than building whole new metro rail lines. So focusing on bus and optimizing the existing system. And then we looked at 4 different options for new metro rail lines and to provide that capacity through the corridor. First, the no-build alternative. So this is essentially the system as it's envisioned currently to be by the year 2040. Basically, it's the existing system, plus some of the projects that the local jurisdictions are already committed to building, finishing the Purple Line in the Maryland suburbs, for example. There's a couple of BRT projects, one in Montgomery, one in Fairfax County, that have been moving forward. That would be included in a no-build alternative. No-build would also include the rail modernization and state of good repair projects that Metro is currently working on and will continue to do into the future. So those kinds of things that have already been committed would be included in this no-build alternative. We'd also look at restoring some of the service levels on the orange and the silver lines back to 6-minute service in the peak period. But doing that, because of the constraints at the Roslyn Tunnel in terms of the number of vehicles we can get through, if you restore a 6-minute service on the orange and silver, you've got to cut back service on the blue line to about a 12-minute during the peak. So all of those things are included in what we called the no-build alternative, kind of a baseline for comparing the relative performance of the other alternatives that we're looking at. Second alternative, the rail optimization and bus service alternative. We often hear that called the lower capital cost option. So these are low cost things that we could do to maybe meet needs. That would include some new bus rapid transit lines, as well as some new commuter bus services to help take the pressure off the rail system in the future. It would also include exploring ways to have more capacity at our transfer stations and on our rail vehicles. So is there a different way to configure new rail vehicles to give it more capacity that could handle the kind of loads we're expecting in the future? And we also looked at the possibility of making some capital improvements in the area of West Falls Church and in the area of Stadium Armory that would allow us to optimize the services that we provide through the corridor and better be able to match them with the demand in the future. So those kinds of lower cost, capital cost alternatives. This next slide just gives you a little overview of some of the bus options that I mentioned. So some new BRT lines coming in from Virginia to DC, as well as from the Prince George's County area into DC, as well as a number of commuter bus routes. Now, the key to making this alternative successful is to design these services that are going to make it attractive enough that people on crowded rail lines are going to be willing to maybe switch to some bus-oriented, some improved and premium bus-oriented services. So it's going to require that we can have folks would actually make that shift. It also requires that the local jurisdictions make a commitment and stick to a commitment to add a lot of the bus priority features into their roadway systems and their transportation systems. So things like bus-only lanes and signal priority for transit. So all those things are going to be necessary to make this alternative actually work and perform in the way that, that was intended. This next option is the first of 4 new Metro Rail options, so alternative 3. So this would include separating the blue line from the orange and silver, building a new second Roslyn station to serve that new blue line. So this would be a second Roslyn station in a tunnel, probably a block or 2 blocks west of the existing Roslyn station, and it would be connected to the existing Roslyn station with pedestrian tunnels, so there could be a transfer of passengers between the lines still. But the blue line would be on its own separate alignment, separate from the orange and silver. Then the blue line would extend in a new tunnel under the Potomac River over to Georgetown, and then turn to the east, generally along an M Street alignment through Northwest DC over to Union Station. And there would be obviously transfers opportunities at stations for the red line in the area of Farragut North and the green and yellow lines at the convention center area as well. And all 4 of the rail alternatives I'm going to talk about share that common new blue line segment from a Roslyn 2 station over to Union Station. In the case of alternative 3, as it moves east of Union Station, this would curve to the northeast, serve the Ivy City area, the Port Towns area in Prince George's County, and then up to College Park and Greenbelt. This alternative, as all the build rail alternatives, do actually address the 4 goals that Mark laid out earlier to different degrees. This particular alternative would do well at reducing delays and improving on-time performance. It wouldn't do as well as the other alternatives in terms of attracting new riders and new revenues to transit. As you can see in the map, when you look up close, it pretty much parallels a lot of existing lines in close proximity. That's a great thing for reducing crowding on those existing lines, to have another alternative so close. So that's a good thing. But on the bad side, it doesn't really give you a lot of opportunities to attract new people to transit or serve new areas. So this option doesn't do quite as well in that. It is the lowest cost of the build rail, the Metro Rail option, so that's a good thing. But again, it doesn't produce a lot of new riders to the system. Alternative 4 is similar in some ways to Alternative 3. It has that separating the blue line from the orange and the silver at Roslyn and following that same route over to Union Station. However, east of Union Station, this would then turn to the south and provide connections to some of the growing areas in DC and Maryland. So places like the Navy Yard, Buzzard Point, the St. Elizabeth's Homeland Security Complex area, and down to National Harbor, across the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, and tie back into the line at Huntington. So it would essentially make like a blue line loop at the center of the system. This has a lot of benefits in terms of attracting new riders and new revenues, so the highest of all the alternatives in terms of new ridership and new revenues. It also provides connections to a lot of employment centers, more so than some of the other alternatives. It also provides a lot of service to those equity emphasis areas that Mark talked about earlier. So it does all those things pretty well. Highest overall ridership of all the alternatives that we looked at, but also significant cost. Second highest of all the alternatives. It's a long route, so and it's a lot of new tunnels, so it's an expensive option. Alternative 5, this completely separates the silver line from the orange and the blue lines. So a new tunnel starting at West Falls Church area and connects over to a new Roslyn 2 station. So it completely separates from the orange and the blue line. That allows express service to be provided on the silver line, as well as continuing local service in that Roslyn to West Falls Church corridor. Beyond the Roslyn 2 station, it follows generally the same alignment over to Union Station as the other alternatives, and then provides a connection up to Greenbelt and College Park, similar to Alternative 3. This provides the most additional capacity of any of the alternatives that we looked at, and because it completely separates the silver from the blue and the orange line, you can run very frequent services on this new line, much better than 6-minute service that we're talking about on the combined orange combined with the other line. And it also provides a significant amount of ridership, not quite as much as Alternative 4 that I just mentioned, but close to it. And but also is a very expensive option, is the most expensive option of all that we looked at. So a lot of benefits, but a lot of cost too. And then finally, Alternative 6. This is separating the silver from the orange and the blue, but just doing that from a new Roslyn 2 station over to Union Station, following that same alignment, and then a fairly direct connection east of Union Station over to New Carrollton, where it would terminate at that location and connect with the orange line and the purple line LRT service. This alternative is best at providing connections from downtown and areas to the east. It also, but it really doesn't provide a lot of new ridership or attract a lot of new riders. Similar to Alternative 3, it follows pretty closely a number of existing alignments. Again, good for reducing crowding, not so good for attracting new riders. Okay. With that, we took those 6 alternatives. We applied a pretty rigorous cost-benefit analysis on each of those things. We looked at 14 individual measures, and those measures related back to the 4 goals that Mark outlined earlier. And based on that information, if you just look at the benefits and the positive impacts, the blue line to National Harbor, the loop option 4, performed the best of all of them, followed by the Silver Line Express, Alternative 5 that I just mentioned. Those 2 performed the best when you look at benefits and positive impacts. But if you prioritize cost savings and cost effectiveness, then the rail optimization and bus service and that lower capital cost option performs better, followed by the blue line to National Harbor option. So what I've done here in the bottom of this table is just kind of list the alternatives based on how they performed against the 4 goals. So blue line to National Harbor, shown at the top, and then followed by the Silver Line Express in Virginia. We've also shown the number of new trips, the annual revenue, construction cost, and the operating costs associated with each of those. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mark, who's going to wrap things up.
Thank you, Mark. All right, I promise we're almost finished talking at you because we held this meeting so that we could actually hear from you. So I just want to really quickly review where we go from here, what the next steps are after today's meeting. As I mentioned earlier, this is our last public meeting for this round, and we have that online survey that you probably, hopefully heard about earlier, that's going to run through the end of September. So we'll be taking public comments through the end of September, and then we're going to go out to our stakeholder committees I mentioned, our community partners, and elected officials, and talk to them, tell them what we heard from you, and we're going to do that roughly over October and November. And then at some point, we're going to come back, give all that information to our board of directors, and support their decision in choosing that locally preferred alternative, which one of these 6 alternatives. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, at the beginning of the presentation, that is the end of the beginning. There's a lot of work that comes after that. And it kind of starts to meld into the question you might be asking yourselves that I've heard a lot since we started this study, and that's why now? Why, when our ridership is still decreased after COVID, why are we talking about, capacity and crowding on the blue, orange, and silver lines and maybe building new rail lines? And the answer is twofold. One, because as I mentioned earlier when I was walking through the capacity and reliability information, because of all the growth and development that's going to happen around these lines, we are confident that our ridership will increase and we will actually have those crowding issues in the future by 2040. But 2 is also what I mentioned about this being the end of the beginning. You saw some of the price tags today of these 6 alternatives. They're big ticket items. That means that Metro and the region probably aren't going to want to build this solely with local money, regional money. We're going to want to go for federal funding to support it. And when you do that, when you go for federal grants, it comes with a lot of process requirements attached to it. So this timeline you can see here, it's an illustrative timeline, not necessarily exactly what will happen with this project, but you can see from this that it's likely that that federal process will take us 10 to 20 years to get through, depending on the scale of what the preferred alternative is. So keep in mind that even though today it doesn't seem like we might need something like this, if we need it by 2040, and we're looking at a 10 to 20 year timeline, we need to be working on this now. We need to be advancing and moving this stuff through that federal process. Things like environmental review, project development, and eventually engineering and design. So I just wanted to close on that note because it's a very common question. I figured I'd be proactive in answering it. So that is the end of the presentation. That's the end of us talking to you. I just want to say thank you one more time for coming out. I'm going to turn it back to LaToya, who's going to walk you through the instructions for the Q&A. But I also want to point out that on the slide, for those of you who are on the Zoom meeting as well, you can go to the study website and access the survey. And again, that's going to be open until the end of September. Thank you. LaToya.
All right, so we're now going to begin our 45-minute Q&A period. I'm going to give folks a couple of instructions, and we'll go over how we're going to go through the order of Q&A. If you are in the room with us today, you will see the option to use microphones for verbal questions and comments, and you will also have received an index card and a pen on your seat or when you arrived to provide written questions. If you have written questions, and again, I'll go over the order of how we're doing this, but if you have written questions, please write your question on the card and raise your hand high so we can see you. And when you're done with that, someone will come around and collect your question. We are going to rotate through the room, and that's the in-person room as well as the virtual room, in order to hear as many questions and comments as we can. And some may be consolidated if we see repetition or common themes in the questions we receive. The order will be as follows. First, we're going to do in-person via microphone. So if you want to make a comment and you are physically here in the room and you want to speak, raise your hand to get a mic. That'll be the first group up, followed by in-person with a written comment. So if you have a written question, continue to write those down, raise your hand, we'll collect those. Then we will go to the webinar Q&A box. And then last but not least, we'll go to the phone participant. So we'll do one each from those categories and continue the rotation back around. So in-person via mic, in-person note card question, webinar Q&A box, and then phone participants. Please keep your comments succinct, brief, and as also respectful. Some specific instructions for each different question type. If you are here in person and you want to ask a question using the microphone, you will have 30 seconds to ask your question. Please raise your hand when prompted to have the mic brought to you. In-person participants who wish to provide written questions, again, use the index card, raise your hand high so we can see you. Someone will come and get the question from you. All questions are being fed to me, so we will get to your question in due time. Webinar participants, again, use the Q&A box through Zoom. For phone participants, if there's anyone who is calling in via phone, you will raise your hand in Zoom by dialing *9. Again, if you're on Zoom, you will raise your hand to let us know that you want to ask a question by dialing *9. And then when your name or the last 4 digits of your phone number are called, you will be asked to unmute your line. And to do that, you will press *6. And then you'll have 30 seconds to ask your question. So again, if you are on the phone, the 2 codes you need to remember, *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute yourself. Some final comments before we start Q&A. Step up, step back. If you see that you're commenting a little too often as we go through the rotation, please make room for others to provide questions and feedback. We will allow each person to ask a question once before doing a repeat on any person, just to make sure everyone has an opportunity to participate. Last but not least, written responses will be provided to all questions, whether or not we've had a chance to address them tonight, after the meeting and available at WMATA's website. So with that, I'm going to shift to the middle of the room, and we are going to get started with our first set of questions from someone who is physically in the room who would like to ask their question via mic. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and someone will bring a microphone to you. Yeah, green shirt.
Hi, so for any of these build alternatives, does this include any consideration of how, what shape the new line will take as far as how many tracks? Like, I'm picturing, I think it would be really helpful to have a third track to allow express and skip stop type service. Is that kind of consideration being taken into account at this stage, or would that be for a later stage in the process?
That would be for a later stage in the process, but you can imagine we hear a lot about 3rd and 4th tracks at WMATA, so it's something we'll consider.
Yeah, I think it would be a good thing to consider. Thanks.
And as well as a lot of connections between tracks that allows, even if it's not part of revenue service, but allows us to move trains from one track to the other. That's included as well.
Okay, I'm going to jump to a Zoom question. There's a note card question I can see getting typed into. Oh, actually just popped up. Note card question. Can a cross-platform transfer station be built in Roslyn?
I don't believe so. I think when we looked at, in 2014, there was an analysis of the subsurface conditions, the underground conditions around the Roslyn station when we first looked at a Roslyn 2 station. I think from what I remember of that study, and maybe someone on the consultant team can remember the details more, it would be almost impossible to expand the existing Roslyn station with 2 more tracks and a tunnel connection. So that's why our Roslyn 2 option looks at a separate Roslyn 2 station, but with an underground pedestrian tunnel linking them, instead of the full, all 4 tracks being at Roslyn.
Yeah, and I think that the vault type construction that you see in Washington makes it difficult to turn that into a much bigger station, right? So it's a little easier and probably less complex and potentially maybe less expensive, to have a separate one with its vault, but then provide pedestrian connections between them.
That said, I know we have a lot more questions. Kind of consistent with the answer to the first question in the room, the BOS study and this preferred alternative that we'll select at the end, I think of it as more of like a corridor and an idea, which we'll continue to iterate on and do a lot more development and work on. So it's possible that as we do if we get into the like 30% design for a project like this, we'll find out that we can actually do that at Roslyn 2 and have that cross-platform connection, because that would be obviously a superior choice. But it's one of those things we can look at in the next phase.
From Zoom, my question is, if you want to do this project, is it a smart idea to add more trains? For example, 8 cars can extend to 12 cars. In New York, the Long Island Railway, the Lear, and the MTA are announcing adding more rail cars to successfully accommodate the busy, huge crowds of riders trying to get to their destination from point A to point B. Also, can you keep older Metro cars and reserve them? Like what happened with the 8000 series cars that went out of service, and then we needed older cars as part of the fleet for backup.
I'll defer the second part of the question to updating our rail fleet plan. Every piece of equipment Metro has what we call a period of useful life attached to it. So about approximately halfway through that, we do an overhaul and try to do repairs to it and make kind of like freshen it up and make sure it can live out its useful life, but it does have an end date. So we have to be responsible in terms of safety and reliability to retire old equipment when it reaches that period. So I can't commit that we would keep old rail cars past that useful life. But that being said, we only retire them when we need to. So whatever fleet we have at the time when we construct this in 2040, we'll buy new rail cars for the capacity, for the number of rail cars we need for that new service. I have no idea at that point exactly what our fleet configuration would be and how many would be older, but we do need to retire at the end of that useful life. In terms of 12-car trains or consists larger than 8, all of our current platforms have a maximum length of 8 rail cars, and a lot of our garage, our rail yard capacity and equipment is meant to handle either 1 rail car at a time or two-car consists and configured in 8 cars. So I think we'd probably stick with that for this for any potential realignment because we like that interoperability. We don't want to have a fleet that can really only be used for 1 line.
All right, I'm going to go to the room. There was a hand on this side of the room. Yes, 3rd row, button-down shirt.
Thank you. I think that the most important parts for a new rail line are no redundant tracks and no interlining. As someone who was taking the blue line here today, I had to leave the train and then bike here and got very sweaty because of the weather. So out of all these, the only ones that don't have redundant tracks and interlining is National Harbor. However, I'm a little concerned about the drawbridge, which I believe Metro will be running on. Are there any plans to maybe have a turnback ability at the National Harbor Station? That way we don't have cascading delays on the blue, yellow, and green lines when the drawbridge is opened?
So one of the operating assumptions we have right now at this very high level of conceptual development is that any time the new alignment, the new line is close to or connecting to the existing system, we would have a pocket track and some sort of configuration to be able to give us reliability and let us turn around trains or store relief trains. In terms of the National Harbor line in particular, I will note, to your point about reliability and not interlining, the Alternative 5, the Silver Express in Virginia, that one is completely separated. So that one actually would do what you're talking about in terms of be a completely independent rail line like the Red Line is. We did look at the drawbridge plans for the Wilson Bridge, and we've been informed by some partners as well as a consultant team that the current operating plan, it only goes up about 65 times a year. So we would actually have to agree with MTA, with the bridge administration, about how we would handle those scheduled openings, and they are scheduled in advance. So we would know we would be able to flex our operations around that. But it is, I mean, it would happen around 65 times a year. We would have to have some sort of arrangement. So that's, again, that kind of iteration, a pocket track or something around National Harbor, is one of those iterations we can look at the next phase.
I would just add that the bridge openings are usually maintenance checks, and they're usually scheduled in advance, and they're usually can be in like the wee hours of the morning, maybe when Metro is not operating. So even that impact can be relatively limited.
From the written note cards, when the LPA is chosen, what factor will decide which phase is built first? I assume since the Georgetown Union Station is on all options, will that probably be first?
That's actually a difficult question to answer today because in addition to the technical impacts, the problems we're trying to solve and which one of these pieces of a particular LPA might be built first if we phase it, there's also the funding issues and the political issues. So that's to be honest, something, a decision that'll be made at a future time.
From Zoom, anecdotally, I've observed the most support among the public for option 4. Are you finding this too?
Option 4 being the Blue Line to National Harbor. I will say that in the comments we've received to date, it has emerged as the one selected most often. But keep in mind, our engagement isn't over yet. We have until September 30th.
Coming back to the room for an in-person question, we go to this side of the room. Gentleman in the back of the room, blue shirt, hand up in the row. Yep, keep your hand up real quick, just so we see you. Thank you.
Hi. So you stated that the Alternative 5, the Silver Line Express in Virginia, has the highest estimated cost. I'm just curious if you could quantify how much of that is incurred by the additional tunnel in the Rockland to Falls Church segment.
The cost difference, we did it on a cost per mile basis, but because the Silver Line Express part is completely tunneled further out, so the other alternatives assume tunneled metro in the core, but when it gets out to like a place like National Harbor, we assume it's surface running or elevated. But that the Silver Line tunnel all the way in Virginia would be tunneled all the way to West Falls Church. So that is the cost driver in terms of compared to the other alternatives.
Thanks.
From the note cards, did this study consider the current bus network's effects on feeding riders into the system, or does new ridership only count walks to Metro or something else?
We accounted for all ridership using the regional travel demand model as well as observed data at the time. And we also considered bus ridership when we were looking at that alternative 2, the rail optimization and bus service. That said, if that alternative 2 was selected as a locally preferred alternative, the alignments, the routes we would choose would all be based off of ridership at the time and the results of things like the Better Bus Network redesign. So we do actually consider the bus transfers and the bus ridership in terms of all like comprehensive metro ridership, and we also looked at connections between other providers, like the other local buses in the region.
From Zoom, how much are you considering tourist? We live about 3 hours away via Amtrak and visit DC 4 to 5 times yearly. We greatly rely on Metro, but our financial impact is small. Love the Blue Line alternative that adds Union Station and National Harbor. That would greatly attract more outside folks like us.
I would say that we factored in tourism in terms of, to the degree that it's captured by the regional travel demand model and our ridership data that drives the regional travel demand model. But tourism specifically, you know, we kind of have to focus on the needs of our most common riders and what we see on a weekly, daily basis. But that was one of the drivers behind the idea of having an option, and you'll see it across all 4 of the rail alignments and also the BRT options serving Union Station, because we know how important that is for connectivity and for tourism and driving all that regional interconnection, like through Amtrak, MARC, VRE. So we did consider it in that regard.
And come back to the room on this side, gray suit.
Yeah. Firstly, thank you for being here, taking the public's input, and for staying late to put on this event. We really appreciate it. My question is specifically focused on Alternative 4. You know, I understand that there's a lot of potential cost and schedule kind of speed bumps ahead, but it's a particularly vast stretch. Can you talk a little bit more about what the potential kind of schedule and cost drivers are specifically with Alternative 4?
Specifically, we would phase it. Any of these rail alignments, I think, are too long, too large, and too expensive to build all at once. We would never get that much federal funding. So in terms of figuring out how any one of them might be phased, what that looks like, what the segments are, we would have to look at that through the results of the environmental review. We would look at what kind of federal funding we have a reasonable expectation of getting for each phase, and then try to ratio it accordingly. But of course, and Mark is waiting to tell me this or waiting to put this input in, federal grants and the environmental review process require that any phase, any alignment, has what we call independent utility. So it has to function and stand alone as a transportation service. So you don't really want to just go like one extra station if it's not actually like serving an independent function. So we would have to consider that as well in terms of deciding how the phasing would actually be aligned.
Yeah. So just adding to that is basically each segment has to live on its own, even if you never build the rest of it. It has to be providing benefit and be of value. And it has to have a logical sort of terminus point. You can't just build it there and then hope someday we'll get somewhere where people want to go. I mean, that's not how you can do it. So.
From the note card questions, loop lines and other systems can have operational problems. Why then is WMATA considering building a loop line?
Well, for one thing that we need to do, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but we assumed any of the new rail alignments have to connect to an existing rail yard. If you look at where we're serving, right, it's pretty much the urbanized core of the region, not DC in specific, but the urbanized core. It's going to be nearly impossible for us to find enough land for a new rail yard to serve one of these. Those are large facilities, and there's just not a lot of vacant land sitting around. So because we knew we wanted to connect to a rail yard, but we also, because of all the data analysis that we did, we looked at, like, remember, equity, development goals, and the capacity goals, that Southern Prince George's, like Southeast DC, Southern Prince George's, and National Harbor really performed well in terms of equity and support for development. So once you go down there, if you want to connect to a rail yard, you pretty much have to go over to the Alexandria yard. So that's why it ends up being a loop. Now, I will note that, again, when we have these future phases like project development, environmental review, that's when you start really getting to like 30% design, 60% design, crafting an operating plan. We might find that the loop configuration would cause too many issues, so it might end up being like a really large backward C rather than a full loop. I mean, these are iterations we can look at the future.
From Zoom, concerning alternative 5, how much estimated time would be saved when comparing the Silver Express service versus the current West Falls Church to Roslyn Silver Track?
It's interesting. I feel like that question has come up every time at one of these meetings, and for some reason I just can't. I think this person is asking for an actual minutes. If someone on the project team remembers, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but if not, that could be one of the answers that we'll follow up with the written questions that we'll post to the website. But I have to be honest, off the top of my head, I don't remember what the time savings is.
Okay, question from the room on this side, gentleman with the Nats cap on. Yeah. Let's get you a microphone first, just to make sure that everyone hears the question.
I've noticed in Alternative 4, you were talking about building a transfer station at Capitol South. In order to do that, you would have to temporarily carve up a part of Folger Park and possibly tear down a Catholic church. But who cares about a Catholic church? That's going to be because on First Street you have that, and you have the Amtrak tunnel, which precludes any building of a transfer station right on First Street. You're going to have to go north and south and Second Street. That's going to be a major headache to have it built.
Well, take the point under advisement. Sorry, the microphone's a little bit weird. I just want to remind people that all these, at this point, these are all more like conceptual ideas, conceptual designs. There's no engineering. Well, there's very little engineering and design behind it. I won't say no, because, we did get some. But the constraints, the physical realities of building this are, again, something that we'll do in that project development phase. And it's pretty typical for any of you who have followed large transportation projects like this. During environmental review and project development, it's pretty typical for station locations to move around a little bit, for an alignment to shift from one block to the next as you continue to iterate on the design. So, I mean, that's a very fair point, and that may well be what we find, that station has to move a little.
From the note card questions, the BOS study has made clear that a new tunnel from Roslyn Union Station via M Street should be part of the next rail project. How much do we need to know about northeast or southeast, blue or silver, before moving forward with the most important segment of any alternative?
That's an interesting question. I do think that when you remember that we have 4 different goals that we're trying to achieve, and these weren't 4 goals that were just crafted, by Metro and the consultant team sitting alone. It was with you It was with our community partners, our stakeholder, and our jurisdictional partners. So while that core alignment between ROS and Union Station is the key for the capacity and crowding issues, it wouldn't necessarily help us address the equity issues, the sustainability issues, maybe not the reliability issues, or at least not fully the reliability issues. So while that is pretty set, I think it's important to at least initially identify the full LPA. And then again, as we move that project through project development and we talk to the federal government about, what the landscape looks like for federal funding, it may be that that's the project. But I don't want to shortchange those 4 goals and the regional input and just assume that that would be the only thing we would ever build for this corridor.
From Zoom, on the new tunnel shared by alternatives 3 to 6, only alternative 4 has a station between Mount Vernon Square and Union Station. Why isn't this station in the other alternatives? As someone who lives in the area, I want to voice my strong support for the station.
We'll take that point under advisement. I will say, and I think Mark might have an answer too, Metro Rail has very physical limitations of what the curvature can be if you're serving like between stations. I'm not phrasing that exactly eloquently, but because of the alignments we chose and the corridor, the streets or proximate locations we're trying to serve, for some of the alternatives, the Union Station has to be at the front or near the front of the building, and for at least one of them, maybe 2 of them, it has to be on like near 8th Street or Burnham Place. And because of that, if you're at the 8th Street or Burnham Place one, the Mount Vernon station I think is too close to have to serve that Union Station. But if there's anything more specific,
It's basically how the alignment has to point to where it's ultimately going to go. Has some variation on how it approaches Union Station and what stations we can fit in between Union Station and the convention center area.
but the point is a good one, and I encourage, if you feel strongly about it, to send that to us in an email, as well as keep abreast of the study as we move forward in project development and come to our meetings at that time.
Before I come back to the room, just want to remind any of our phone participants, if you're on the phone and you want to ask a question, dial *9 to raise your hand and then *6 to unmute yourself. Coming back to the room for an in-person question, my left, far right, right in front of you, Rohan. Yep, thank you.
So I just wanted to understand, for like a no-build alternative, how bad would the capacity issue be? Say if we, I don't know, put fully walk-through tracks, put little reminders telling people to spread out on the platform, and just kept the current trackage. Would there be like huge lines going to every station, or would it just kind of be more people standing up? Like, what's the scale of this core capacity problem?
It is at least. I want to note that in that next phase I talked about, we're going to redo all the ridership forecasts. We're not redoing it now, but at least pre-COVID, our 2040 targets showed us that we would routinely, during the peak hour, have passenger loads of, I think it was like 165 to 180 ppc. In the peak of the peak train, at least in a model, it would go near 200 or over. And our service standard for acceptable levels of crowding is 100 ppc. So to translate that, it's a ton of people crowded like sardines into the trains, and other people trying to hold doors to get on, and the lines backing up and causing also capacity constraints on our escalators and stairs. So that's the kind of future we're talking about with the no build. I will note, it's important to say, we have, again, like our capital program is doing great things with state of good repair, so it would be more reliable, right? We wouldn't have as many mechanical issues and track issues, but because of that capacity and crowding issue, we'd still have a lot of people holding doors, which has reliability impacts as well, and so not just the crowding.
From the no car questions, for alternative number 2, what was the logic behind turning back the silver line instead of, say, the orange line at West Falls Church?
It could actually be either. That West Falls Church junction infrastructure that we put in there could be orange or silver. It's just the operating. We had to choose something to model, so that's what we modeled. Because I will say, for one thing, there's a lot of support and a lot of development happening on the Silver Line, and there's a lot of interest from our jurisdictional partners in making that work and making it work well. So one thing I should emphasize is, because we have that 26 train per hour limit on any set of tracks, if you actually did create that turnback for the Silver Line, you would be able to run up to 26 trains per hour in that Tyson's alignment. It wouldn't be able to go into DC, right? Because then it would connect to the Orange Line, and then it would connect to the Blue Line, and then we have to have that 10 to 11 train per hour limit. But if it only operated from Ashburn to West Falls Church and could turn around at West Falls Church, that's a 26, that gets up to 26 trains per hour. That's one of the other reasons we chose that.
From Zoom, can you briefly summarize what bus changes, if any, are included in the 3 rail construction options?
Oh, and we haven't looked at the bus service changes for the rail options. That would be a future iteration when we're ready to actually do service planning.
Let me come back to the room for questions on this side. Gentleman in the red burgundy polo. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm looking at alternatives 3, 5, and 6, which are all designed to utilize excess storage capacity at Dulles and Falls Church and Greenbelt. However, 4 will only connect to Alexandria Yard, as you alluded to earlier, which is shared as well with Yellow. Is that going to constrain service on the Blue Loop alignment, having enough cars to operate that effectively? And then beyond that, is there any options of, I know not now including a rail yard, but maybe 15, 20 years beyond, for any of the build rail alignments, including rail yard connections?
So we actually did build into our capital cost assumptions expansion of any of the rail yards we were connecting to, whether it was Greenbelt, Dulles, or Alexandria. So we have the means, and we actually factored into the cost estimate of each alternative. Assuming we get the federal funding and the regional funding, we would have the financing to expand that as well. In terms of actually locating a new rail yard, as you mentioned at the end, I just really don't see that as a possibility given the development patterns in the region, unless it was really, really far out. And we already have issues. I think the further you go out, you end up having a lot of deadhead service where you're running trains back to the yard without carrying passengers and they're not paying revenue. So it's an expensive proposition the further out your bus garages and rail yards are.
From the no-car questions, would TOD, or transit-oriented development, be the default land use WMATA is going for? It would shore up WMATA finances.
I mean, absolutely. We are probably the biggest champions you'll find of transit-oriented development. We want it everywhere. We want it at every station, and we want as much of it as we can possibly get. And maybe in some cases that means helping the jurisdiction catalyze it. We do joint development on property that we own and hope that that triggers more development around the station. So yes, absolutely.
From Zoom, as someone who lives near one of the new Silver Line stations in Virginia and has been using the Silver Line since 2014, all of the alternatives that make changes to the Silver Line seem to make it less useful than it is today by avoiding the most popular destinations in downtown DC. The Blue Line loop alternative seems less disruptive to current travel patterns and commutes overall, not just for the Silver Line, and the rail access that it would bring to completely underserved areas is extremely appealing.
I appreciate the comment. We'll take it under advisement.
Okay, I'll take a question from the room. This side. Here with the checkered blue and gold shirt.
Are there any particular lessons learned you've taken from the Silver Line planning and construction process that you've brought into any of these new alternatives?
It takes a long time.
Yeah, it takes a long time
for these lines to get through the process. That's for sure.
Yeah, and there are ways to value engineer, but you also want to make sure that you're achieving the goal that you set out with. Sorry, those are very high-level answers, but that's what I have for you now.
From our note card questions, will new stations have platforms? Oh,
Sorry, I actually just thought of one more thing, because I did mention this at the second public meeting out in Maryland. I think that anytime we move forward with a new rail corridor, we should absolutely partner with that jurisdiction on a aggressive and ambitious development plan for the areas around. Make sure that they're not only got the right zoning, but have assembled the right development tools to make sure that we can get that kind of level of TOD I was talking about and try to prevent or minimize gentrification and displacement at the same time. So that's a lesson I would say is learned.
From the note cards, will new stations have platform screen doors?
That's another iteration we'll look at in the next phase, but we did not actually assume that at this time.
From Zoom, for the Blue Line Loop proposal, what if the Metro Rail was not linked with the Wilson Bridge, but had its own bridge at a different crossing, or even a tunnel under the river? Or is that just prohibitive financially?
It's already an incredibly expensive project, so it would be a lot more money on top of that, but I wouldn't say at this point anything's prohibitive. It's an interesting idea, and we can look at that for any of the alternatives, including, running any of these alternatives over the Potomac or under the Potomac is a new bridge as well. So we can look at that.
Okay, coming back to the room on this side, second row right here, Paisley shirt. We have a microphone coming to you. 1 second.
Hello, thank you very much for hosting this, and I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. I'm going to contextualize my question with a comment first. My comments primarily address the service and equity issues around the Orange Line in New Carrollton. Therefore, they also touch on the Purple Line, and I really appreciate the comments that have been made about Union Station because I haven't seen that reflected in the materials. No change matters if I can't get to Metro. It's all irrelevant. I access New Carrollton from the Seabrook Mark Station. Disability access was paramount, and that has the best disability access to get on and off the trains. However, the service and equity there is lacking. Weekdays, between 37 to 44% of the trains skip Seabrook. I cannot get 2.5 miles to New Carrollton, nor can my disabled family members and friends, because the train just doesn't stop. It doesn't cost anything to stop the train. In addition, the Metro bus that goes through there does not have service between 8:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. It only deals with the rush hours. And both Mark and the bus have zero service on the weekends. There's no access whatsoever to get to New Carrollton, and I can expound afterwards on anything that's interested about some of the details of this. On the 3.5-hour delay on the Mark today, I got a chance to talk to lots of people. 75% of the Mark riders, and there were 700 to 800 people on the Mark train today in this delay. 75% of them were taking some form of Mark when they got off. So the comments about Union Station are really critical. Zero knew this meeting was happening, and none of them knew anything about these proposals. Near the Seabrook Station, there's been about 1,000 new units built during the pandemic. There's a huge development about a mile away, so that puts it at 3.5 miles away from New Carrollton. And the other portion of that is within walking distance of the Seabrook. It's less than half a mile, and it's huge. So it's not necessarily future development. There's a lot already going on. So my question is, going forward, how will the stakeholder engagement evolve to capture a larger audience of those that are already engaged in the system, in the commuting system, and those potential but not yet reached populations?
I appreciate the comments and the question. I'm going to ask one thing. It looks like you wrote them down. So can you make sure that you pass that along to me or somebody else on the team after the meeting? I appreciate it. But I do want to make sure that everyone understands WMATA doesn't operate the MARC system. So I'm much more than willing to pass along your comments to them and our partners at Prince George's who operate the bus. But there's not really anything I can answer for or tell them to do about MARC service or the bus. However, we do have people in the room who can take your comments to our bus planning team, who's also working on the Better Bus Network redesign, which I hope you've heard about. Okay, well, they're here, and I would love for you to talk to them and hand us your comments. In terms of outreach, that's what I knew there was a second part to that. It's possible that the MARC customers don't really know because, again, we're not really focused on MARC service, but we do lean a lot on community-based organizations and elected officials' staff to help us spread the word about this kind of engagement. So what I'm hearing for you is that maybe, I think we did a pretty good job, but there's always room for improvement. So whenever we come back out and do this, we will just double down on that and try to get even more community-based organizations at the table, because I also want people to understand that when we go to that next phase, that project development and environmental review I was talking about, we're going to have to do public engagement then too, and have more stakeholder meetings then too. So we'll do what we can. And if you have any ideas, add that to the list to get that communication out there.
From our note card questions, are you considering the new hybrid work environment that is prevalent today in terms of lower peak ridership?
We certainly are. We look at that every single day, and I will note that we're all excited. I hope you follow, or at least occasionally see our social media and our GM social media. We keep breaking records for ridership increases this year. So we're pretty confident that we're going to come back, and we're going to come back strong. That said, I think I noted earlier that our forecasts for ridership and crowding that I talked about earlier are from 2019. We will redo those. I feel like I keep kicking the can, but we are going to redo them during environmental review and project development. In fact, we have to. The federal government will not allow us to apply for federal grants with 2019 ridership data. So we're going to do that. It's just, to be honest, we want like enough data and enough time to be sure, or at least confident, that we can accurately predict the future. You need longitudinal data to do that. And since right now we're still, even though it's 2023, we're still seeing our ridership growing, and we're still seeing the whole region coming out of the pandemic, we're seeing the federal government starting to return to the office more. So this isn't the right time. We still need a little bit more time to see how ridership responds to those kind of policy changes.
From Zoom, why does the environmental study take so long? How is it anything but an unequivocal benefit in terms of the environment? The mode of transportation that isn't a private car is becoming the more attractive option.
I could not agree more, but unfortunately the requirements of federal review, environmental review, are set by the federal government, and they're pretty stringent requirements. So I will say that it also depends on the scope of your project. If you're doing something that's just kind of, playing around within the existing right-of-way, within your existing alignment, that's a much smaller ask from the federal government. You can do that in probably 6 months, depending on the scale. But when you're talking about like building a new rail line, we're seeing the environmental impact study, the highest level of environmental review, those often take an average of like 4 years. And that's not our choice.
Take a question from the room. Back row, very last row in the blue polo shirt. If folks are in the room, you're probably seeing a theme. I'm kind of bouncing back and forth, so we will get to your question.
Okay, thank you. 2 questions. So if we decide on a locally preferred alternative that uses the Silver Line Express, was I-66 considered as another alignment? The Silver Line Express would be 4 tracks wide through East Falls Church and then bypass Boston on I-66. Is the median of I-66 still reserved for Metro, or would it be easy for Metro to obtain? And then the second question, if some of these alternatives would be multi-decade construction projects, how much was adaptability to challenges in funding or construction that we might encounter considered? Based on the comments of the geologist from the first meeting who said that he thought it would be extremely difficult to build a second tunnel through Roslyn, I think it would be unlikely that 2 river tunnels would be built, or even 1 tunnel with any significant adjustments before we run into some issues in building a segment or run out of funding. Thank you.
I'm going to answer the second question first, and that is, we need to do at least 30% design before we really know exactly how expensive, or like what all the construction considerations are going to be, and probably actually more like 60% design. But that geologist he's referring to, I believe, was in the Virginia meeting and made some very good points. And in fact, if you read Greater Washington, he recently wrote a blog post in there, and it's very smart. I encourage you to look at it. Yeah, I mean, that's a very real construction constraint that we have to consider, and it's possible that it would increase the price. I don't mean to keep being vague, or again, like saying we'll study that, but there are only so many questions you can answer when you're at like less than 10% design, and geology is one of them. So that's one of the major constraints that we'll have to be looking at. To answer your first question, I hope, I'm pretty sure that I-66 west to like Gainesville is still, by policy, reserved for Metro. They've always wanted that down the center median, and I think they still consider that a reserved space. However, moving east right, into DC, I think the configuration of the existing orange line would make it very difficult to run yet another line on top of or below that. And we also did get input from our jurisdictional partners at Arlington, who asked us to look at specific station locations or, general station locations. And that's why the current alignment ended up being the way it is. I don't know if there was anything else you want to say about 66.
Just that, at this level, we wanted to make sure we were kind of assuming the most expensive, just because we wanted to make sure that our cost estimates weren't we weren't underestimating costs. So because we're not at a level of design to know about whether all those other variations could work that might drive the cost down, we wanted to be conservative on cost estimates, so we assumed that it was a tunnel all through that area.
From the note card questions, with climate change causing heat waves, even to the point of warping tracks in the case of Amtrak, how is WMATA factoring in climate resiliency, especially with outdoor stations?
I don't think we have a specific approach to warping tracks or climate resiliency for this study. We will enact and implement any resilient treatments for tracks and other system components that WMATA implements system-wide. So it's not specific for this Blue Orange Silver study, but anything we build will use like the best state-of-the-practice, state-of-the-art equipment that we have.
From Zoom, have you considered other light rail transit options to potentially offset ridership increases with the turnback infrastructure, but at the same time, theoretically cost less money to build?
I think that one of the difficulties in trying to talk about these 6 alternatives that we're looking specifically at the Blue, Orange, and Silver corridor. We're looking specifically at the needs and opportunities in the corridor and the alternatives that we think can meet those 4 goal statements. So in looking at those 4 goals, at least at the time, we didn't believe that light rail was going to move the needle enough and in terms of meeting those 4 goals. I will say that if that LPA corridor is selected, that during project development in NEPA, we can still look at what the impacts might be, what the costs and benefits might be of doing that as light rail or bus rapid transit or another mode, but probably light rail, or segments of it could be light rail and segments of it could be metro rail. Like again, there's a lot more reconfiguration, a lot more analysis that we do, a lot more iteration that we do during project development. It's not just the study. Every major transportation project is like this. The further you go in that process, the more detailed and defined it gets. So we can and maybe will look at mode iterations, but at least initially, light rail wouldn't achieve the 4 goals as well as metro rail would.
All right, coming back to the room on this side. Ma'am with the glass on your head. You have a mic coming to you.
Are there any station closures that is part of any of the plans when you talked about that the tracks have to go certain ways? Yeah. If you're moving the stations or adding stations, could any existing stations be set to be closed either temporarily or permanently? And also, when you're talking about ridership increases, are you making any assumptions about expanded hours? Because now going out to Dulles, the last train leaves pretty early. Yeah. And part of the advantage of having it or doesn't start as early, that if you need to get to Dulles for an early flight or you're coming in on an international flight that's later, Metro may be closed and that option's now off the table.
No, it's a good question. So we didn't make assumptions about service span, the hours of operation, specifically for the Blue, Orange, and Silver study, because the way these projects work is the actual operating plan, like the frequencies, the headways, the service hours, that's done much closer to construction, which again is like 10 to 20 years away. And it will be, part of our rail fleet plan as well. So our system-wide approach to determining the service schedule. Can you repeat your first question? Station closures, yeah, okay. There aren't any, no stations currently would permanently close. There's no reason for any of these alternatives that we would close any of the existing stations. During construction, there may be temporary closures depending on how close the alignment would run to the existing system or if it connects to the existing system. But as of right now, I can't think of any that would necessitate a closing.
Sorry, one second. From the note cards, do you have the flexibility to change the selected alternative after this process? For example, if a post-pandemic ridership analysis shows that another alternative now looks more favorable than the one selected?
That's a really good question, something I've thought about several times. When we look at our current ridership versus the pre-pandemic ridership, the levels are different, but the overall patterns of demand, the overall patterns of where people are going hasn't actually changed all that much. So there's no reason to believe that today or in 2019, alternative 4 would have been the best, but today alternative 5 would be better. Like just based purely on a ridership and travel pattern point of view. So I don't think in that next phase, in project development and environmental review, I don't think there's a lot of utility or even possibility to change from one LPA to the other, and I don't think there'd be any need to. But as I mentioned before, like with light rail and station locations, you do iterate on that LPA during project development and environmental review. So things like the alignment might shift a little bit, like one block to another. Station locations might shift. We may decide that some of it could be done by light rail instead of metro rail. We might look at, new rail technologies like CBTC. Those are all things that we'll still be doing in the next phase. But at least right now, I can tell you, like looking at ridership numbers, there's no reason to believe that an LPA that we would select today, that another one would be better 2 years from now.
Excuse me, we're going to go to the Zoom. Thank you. From the Zoom, and alternatives 3, 5, and 6, would the Ivy City and or Fort Lincoln stations provide meaningful walkability and metro access to the U.S. National Arboretum?
I don't remember, actually. Does anyone remember exactly where that station location is? I will say one thing. Anytime we're choosing a new station or like building a new station, yeah. Okay, so go ahead.
I mean, that would be certainly something we would look at and consider. Yeah. Look at and consider as part of design, right? We can shift stations to make them serve important destinations better or less better. But so that's certainly something that can happen there.
And if there was a station in that location, we'd certainly work with the jurisdiction to make sure there's good sidewalks, bike paths, connectivity to the station or from the station to places like the Arboretum.
Let me come to this side of the room. Sunglasses, yes.
Hi. Just a question on the ridership. When you're recalculating it, does the fare evasion part of that and kind of undercounting current ridership, does that cause an issue down the road when you're trying to get the federal funding?
So interestingly, the 2019 information, the data that you saw there, did not count untapped riders or fare evasion, but we are actually now counting that in terms of like the head count. Not for revenue, obviously, but for the actual people on the train. So when we do this, when we rerun the ridership forecast during project development, we will factor that in.
From the note cards, metro systems in Asia and Europe have much lower construction costs than American systems. Is WMATA considering looking at international best practices to control construction costs for any new lines?
We absolutely will. And in fact, I still have on my reading list, like in the top 3, that ENO report on capital construction costs and how they compare to Europe and other systems. So hopefully I will personally learn something, but I know our capital delivery team is very focused on figuring out ways to make our construction and projects and implementation more cost effective.
So we're in the last few minutes of Q&A. I'm going to take one more note card and then go back to the room for questions. If for some reason we do not get to your question, I would like for you to write your question down on a card and please submit it before you leave so we can make sure that we can get a response to the question that you posted with all of the other questions. So the last note card question that we have before I come back to the in-person room questions, are there plans for automation on new rail alignments?
We are returning, there is a plan to return to automated operations, or ATO, but that's a system-wide policy decision by our board. It's not specific to the Blue Orange and Silver Study.
All right, coming back to the room, I'm going to go this side. Anyone in the room who'd like to ask a question on this side? Yes.
If I may, two quick questions. One, are there any plausible advancements in technology or infrastructure that might increase that key constraint you mentioned of 26 trains per hour on a given track within the time horizon? And second, are there any major differences between the alternatives and how amenable they are to phasing, like in terms of getting a large benefit from an initial phase versus getting the largest benefit only at the end?
In terms of the rail systems technology, there is a technology called communications-based train control, where, just to keep it kind of simple, right now our system uses switches along the rail alignment and sends signals back through that system, and it goes back to a train control center, and then it goes back to the train. This actually lets the signals bounce between trains themselves. So like every train knows how close the one in front of it is and the one behind it is. And so it's kind of set up to be a little bit more automated, a little bit more automatic, and you can reduce the space and the time between trains. So we're very cognizant of that, and Metro is actually studying it now. We've got a initiative to figure out if it's worth the investment, if it's going to be part of our capital program moving forward. So we will actually be looking at that in terms of this project, in terms of this capacity constraint. At the project development environmental review I mentioned, we're going to look at what kind of impact we think that might have on capacity and crowding, and see if that fixes the issue. Your second question, which I really thought I remembered, but it's getting late and I blanked on it. What was it again? That's right. I don't think there are any that can't be phased in some way, but I do think that probably the National Harbor and the Silver Line Express lend themselves best to phasing, but all of them can be phased in some way.
All right, coming back to this side of the room, you've had your hand up, sir. Front row. We got a mic coming for you. 1 second.
It's sort of a comment. It seems like the M Street line will only have one train running on it every 6 minutes, and it almost seems like a waste of the tracks. I could see that the two inexpensive ones, well, not inexpensive, but the elevated line that'll probably run down South Capitol Street and Indian Head Highway to National Harbor, and the elevated line that'll run probably alongside the Amtrak tracks out to Hyattsville and Greenbelt. You build those as two elevated lines. They both go into the M Street line. One is a circle. One starts at Roslyn, goes to Greenbelt. You could at least get them both done. 3 and 4 in one grouping without that extra expense. And some people don't realize the M line, if it only has a train the M Street line, if it only has a train every 6 minutes, it's a waste of the tracks. The red line before the pandemic had a train every 2 minutes during rush hour. Before the pandemic, the blue, silver, orange worked perfectly, having a train every 7.5 minutes. That got 24 trains per hour. And each train came, when you went downtown, there was a train every 2.5 minutes. When you said they can't run every 6, they can run every 7.5. And a third thing that was missed at one, if I can just bring up two last things, you could have had originally a silver line that went from Ashburn to Vienna, and the orange line pulled into the center track at West Falls Church, so everybody had a 2-seat ride, but you wouldn't have as much of a problem because the silver line is empty after Reston now. I know in 20 years it'll probably be packed. But now, building a U-shaped line and everybody transfers at West Falls Church might have been easier, and the track, it would have been built like 1/4 mile of track, because that's where the highway goes, has that thing for buses to go. You could have built tracks on it. The last thing is, a light rail line could be built from National Harbor over the Wilson Bridge to King Street, because I can't imagine that millions of people are wanting to go from Bolling Air Force Base to Braddock Road. That's an example. Okay. That's all I was thinking.
Oh, those are good comments, and we have the recording, and we'll take them under advisement. I do want to point out, in terms of the frequencies of 6 minutes you were talking about on M Street, that's only our operating plan assumption to do that cost-benefit analysis, because our rail fleet plan right now calls for us needing, at a system-wide level, the 6-minute peak service by 2040. However, the actual capacity would be 16 additional trains per hour in each direction, like as a maximum, on top of the 26 we can already run, except for that Silver Line Express, because it's completely separated like the Red Line, that would give us 26, an additional 26 trains per hour. So you're looking at like 42 trains per hour crossing the river, or 52. So it's better. We can run more than 6 minute service. We just assumed the 6 minutes so we could do a good comparison. Yeah, exactly.
We're at time, so again, if you have any question you've not had a chance to ask, please go ahead and write it down on a note card. We're going to close out in a second before folks start getting up, but just a reminder, please take your note card before you leave. You can leave it with any of the team members here. And I'm just going to close out. Can I have my remarks back, though?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. All right, again, thank you everyone for your attendance and participation this evening. On behalf of WMATA, we truly appreciate and value your feedback and look forward to sharing updates on this process with you in the coming weeks. A few closeout items before I let you go this evening. We will be here for a few more minutes. If you have questions, you want to speak to someone, see the board, make a new friend at WMATA, please feel free to find someone in the back. We also have the online survey open until September 30th. Please be sure to complete that. You can find the survey and additional information about the study and the alternatives at wamata.com/BOS Study. In-person attendees are also invited to take the survey now on a tablet or scan the QR code to take it later. And again, thank you for coming out. We appreciate your input and have a great evening.